Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. For our Spanish-speaking community, you can hear this event in Spanish. If that makes you more comfortable, just click the interpretation button that looks like a globe on the bottom right of your screen.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Para nuestra comunidad latino, latina, latinx, pueden escuchar este evento en español. Simplemente haga clic en la pantalla, el botón que se mire como un globo. Puede mandar clic y le van a llevar al canal español.
Okay, and my name is Ani Cash. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Rethink Waste Program Manager here at the Environmental Center, our local hub aiming to educate Central Oregonians on sustainable local actions that can make a difference on a larger scale. You can learn more about Rethink Waste and other Environmental Center programs at envirocenter.org. A note that tonight's event is being recorded. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to deliver our land acknowledgement. This is a work in progress. The Environmental Center is on the traditional land of the Northern Paiute, which today includes the Northern Paiute, the Wasco, and the Warm Springs tribes, known as the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation of Oregon. These tribes had interactions with other surrounding tribes as well, which include but are not limited to the Klamath, Modoc, Yahuskin, Santiam, and the Molalla. We recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land where we live, work, recreate, and learn. Land acknowledgement is a new practice for the Environmental Center and a way for us to express gratitude, start dialogue, and encourage education and action. Our facility, garden, and programs exist on stolen land. We are simply guests of our tribal neighbors making homes and legacies in these spaces together. We encourage you to take time to learn about the history where you live, whose land you are on, and how you perpetuate ongoing colonialism. There are many ways to learn about and support our tribal communities in present-day Central Oregon. To start, learn more about the Warm Springs tribe on their website. Visit the Warm Springs Museum and learn about whose land you stand on wherever you are. I will put links of all of this as resources to follow in a follow-up email. So today we are here to hear from Linda Lee, a local cookbook author and avid gardening educator, along with Bryan Mayer, a professional butcher who works for a sustainable venison meat company who's joining us from Hawaii. Before we get to their presentations, I'm just going to give a short introduction from Rethink Waste, but first a couple of housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself muted. I encourage you to put questions in the chat box at any time, and we will get to them after the speakers have finished. Another note, we do have 7 copies of Linda's newest cookbook to give away, plus a $50 gift card from Locavore. The prizes are available for local pickup only, and only those who are attending tonight's event. We will do the drawing after the event and contact the winners by the end of the week. If you would like to be entered into the drawing, please enter your name and email into the Google form that we will put in the chat box shortly. And for those of you joining us through Facebook live stream, we'll add a comment with that link as well. The prizes are, as I mentioned, available for local pickup only. After the panel, I'll be sending out a link to a blog containing all the resources mentioned, including those about native land, a link to the recording of this panel, and some resources from our presenters, including 2 recipes from Linda's book that have been translated into Spanish. So look out for that, please. Okay, so I'm going to go into a quick presentation from myself here, just to give us a little bit of context about why food waste is important. Okay, can everyone see my slide okay? I'm going to take silence as a yes. Okay, so the Environmental Center, as I mentioned, is a hub for sustainability, where we do a lot in the community with the Rethink Waste Project educating on waste reduction, but we have other programming, including the Energy Challenge that teaches about sustainability in the built environment, as well as in electric vehicles. And you can come down to our location at 16 Northwest Kansas Avenue and check out our learning garden there as well. We also do a lot of youth education in the schools, in the community, and outside education. So a little bit about food waste. I'm going to talk about how much there is, why it happens, and why it matters. First, a little bit about not landfill, which is, if you know, our local landfill that's projected to be full by 2029. It is full of 42% organic material. And this is the 2018 waste composition study. So the numbers have changed a little bit. Bend, the city of Bend, is the third fastest city, growing city in the country. So these numbers are probably about the same, but the volume, the total tonnage is definitely growing. So if you break that organic material down a little further, we notice that approximately 26% of that landfill is food waste. So that's a huge chunk. So why is this happening? There are a lot of reasons, and it's happening all along the supply chain. But it's happening at the household level, where it's just unawareness or a lack of information. It's hard for us to learn new habits. It's easy just to serve ourselves too much. Spontaneity, spontaneous pizza outings. People are busy, but there's also waste that happens in commercial kitchens from people expecting a lot of food for their dollar, and just getting too much in general and then having to throw it away or choosing to throw it away. And then it happens on farms. We saw a lot of a big problem with the supply chain in our country because of the pandemic. So it happens there as well. And then it happens in transportation. The average produce travels 1,500 miles to get to our plate. So it's kind of a lot. But thinking about this further, it has social impacts, all of this food waste. It has financial impacts. So, locally, 1 in 6 of our neighbors here is food insecure, meaning that they don't necessarily know where their next meal is going to come from. Financially, we're spending approximately a quarter of our food budget on food that we end up throwing away. That's a lot of money just straight into the trash. And then environmentally, we're also wasting a lot. And I'm going to show a quick movie to give you a perspective on this in a moment. But Paul Dawkins wrote a book called Project Drawdown, where he estimates that food waste is the cause of approximately 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's global scale, 8%. And that's compared to only 2.5% from airplane travel. So it's fairly substantial. Okay. Now I'm going to try to share this short video. So that kind of gives us a little perspective about all of the pieces along the supply chain where stuff gets wasted. It's not just food.
Yes.
And here's a guy eating a
Hi.
hot dog out of a fish.
Suppose
Good job, Bonnie. Okay. Next slide. Great. So the point is there's a lot of stuff that gets wasted all along the supply chain, in the farm, in transport, and at our house. And what we are going to talk about today largely is going to be how we as individuals can reduce the food waste that happens on the household level. We do offer a food waste challenge for free that you can find at rethinkwasteproject.org/food waste. And I, again, will send this out as a resource in a follow-up email, but it is a 4-week long series where you can get tips and tricks about how to waste less food. And number one thing is really just awareness. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing because we're not here really to hear the Ani show all day long. Okay. So now I'm going to take a moment to introduce our first panelist, Linda Lee. Excuse me while I find my notes. Linda Lee is the founder of the award-winning site Garden Betty, honored as the best gardening blog by Country Living and a top 10 gardening blog by Better Homes and Gardens. What became as a creative outlet in 2010 is now a leading resource in the home and garden sphere, reaching millions of readers every year in over 230 countries. The site celebrates the art of living slow and eating well with unique content on modern homesteading, farm-to-table cooking, and outdoor adventuring. Linda's latest book, the No-Waste Vegetable Cookbook from 2020, helps us rethink what's edible and use up all the plants we grow or buy, like the veggie version of Nose to Tail, if you will. An avid outdoor lover, she's also the author of the Backyard Fire Cookbook, the New Camp Cookbook, and the CSA Cookbook. Linda, her site, and her books have been featured in dozens of top-tier publications, including Time Magazine, HGTV, the DIY Network, the Travel Channel, Outside, Food and Wine, the Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian. So welcome, Linda.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm doing great today. Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Linda. I live here in Bend and I write about vegetable gardening and farm to table cooking on my blog, gardenbetty.com. I also wrote several cookbooks and they're all centered around fresh, wholesome food and good cooking at home. So the most recent one is the one you mentioned, the No-Waste Vegetable Cookbook, which takes a top to tail approach to your cooking. So it helps you waste less food simply by composting less, which sounds kind of counterintuitive to what we're always taught. But my belief is the more you throw away, the more expensive your compost becomes. So if you can start in the kitchen with how you utilize all of these different fruits and vegetables that you buy or grow, then you end up with more nutrition and less waste, and you just throw less money away.
Yeah, definitely. Composting is not the same as not wasting food. And that's one of the points that I make sometimes during my longer talks, but it's hard to wrap your head around, right? Because it seems like you're doing a good job or feeding the thing to the dog, but if you're not feeding it to yourself, then you could still consider it waste for sure. So I really enjoy that idea and that approach. So this newest book that I have here, it's amazing. And it's also really cute, has a really cute cover, which I enjoy. So speaking of this book, I'm curious kind of what prompted you to write it? Like, what was it? What pushed you over the edge?
Well, I have been gardening since 2010. So it's only been 10 years, but in that time, that has been my full-time job pretty much because I document everything on my blog. And it started when I moved into this property. It was a 1/4 acre. It was a very small house, but the entire property was pretty much a giant vegetable and fruit garden. And so when I first moved in, I had no idea how to garden. I was just learning as I went along. And the first summer that I was there, I remember harvesting one after another of zucchini, you know, how those things just like keep giving and giving all summer. And it kind of felt like a waste because I felt that I was putting all of this work into seeding and watering and fertilizing and mulching, pruning, doing all of this work to get a good productive zucchini harvest, but I was only using the fruits, the zucchini, whereas I had these super long vines full of leaves and also all the flowers that came up in the meantime, and then also the flowers that would come up and then die because they didn't turn into fruit. And I knew that other cultures used squash leaves in their cooking. And it hadn't occurred to me to use that either. But then one day I was just telling my husband, you know, somebody needs to write a book that shows people what they can do with all of these odds and ends, because these are completely viable plants that we're growing. And then he was like, well, why don't you do it? So that was the idea for the book of taking all of these scraps, what some people consider scraps, like the greens and the stems and the seeds, sometimes the flowers, and learning how to incorporate that into our everyday cooking, but not to the point where it's weird or where it's considered bizarre food, like you're eating something that's unusual. These are just the parts of plants that you already buy or grow. You're just learning how to use them in new ways. And it's not just a matter of using different parts, but also learning how to cook with them in different ways that bring out a whole new range of flavors and textures.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I'm also curious about that process, because I mean, not everything that you could have made has been a great. Did you have any like just the opposite of success recipes where you did have to feed it to the chickens?
Well, yeah, of course.
Mhm.
I think that's just sort of a normal process of recipe developing in general. But if you approach the vegetables in a garden a certain way, when you look at leaves, for example, a lot of them can be used the same way, even if they come from different plants. So I always start by looking at the texture of something and how thick or thin it is, and how mild or bitter or how spicy it might be. So you could take something like, for example, squash leaves. They're large, they're pretty nice and dense, but still pretty tender. They cook down really nice, but they don't wilt completely. And so the way that I see it, it's very similar to chard. So anywhere that you would use chard in your recipes, you could substitute squash leaves for that. And the same thing for like carrot tops, which have a very earthy flavor, and a little goes a long way. So I substitute carrot leaves for parsley in a lot of cases.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I one of the recipes that we had translated into Spanish, because I was really intrigued and I honestly haven't tried it yet, is the carrot top salsa. I think that sounds really awesome, and I look forward to trying it. I honestly have tried carrot top pesto, and yeah, earthy I think is a really good description for the carrots, but adding some vinegar or something to it to spice it up sounds really, really awesome. And I love the idea of your charred stem hummus too. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah, that one is based off of a Eastern Mediterranean recipe. So over there, it's very common to make dips and spreads with roasted vegetables, sort of like baba ganoush. And with charred stems and with a lot of stems from all these other vegetables like collard greens and kale, most people just use the leaves because they might feel that the stems are too fibrous or too tough. They don't want to deal with it, with cooking it down. So the charred stem hummus takes what's ordinarily a waste product, something that you just throw in the kitchen or feed to chickens, and turns that into its own vegetable. Like that's all you use, and you don't use the leaves at all. So when you treat it a certain way, and you add the right flavorings and seasonings, then it becomes a totally new dish that you wouldn't think about otherwise.
Awesome. That's really great. Okay. Well, there's one question before I switch to Brian about where can you buy your book?
So in Bend, I've actually seen it pop up in several local stores. Dudley's Bookshop Cafe is one place that you can always find it. You can also, I believe that you could probably find it at Roundabout Books. So any local bookstore can order it for you. And so I definitely recommend that you support a local store.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, and we'll get back to, there's plenty of opportunity to ask more questions in a moment, but I want to give Brian a chance as well. So Bryan Mayer has been at the forefront. So we're switching now from vegetables to meats. Not that you don't cook meats too, Linda. I saw some good tasting recipes in your book, but so Bryan has been at the forefront of the craft butcher movement in the US, receiving training from master butchers, raising livestock, working on kill floors and mobile slaughter units, behind butcher counters and on kitchen prep lines. Early in his career, he co-developed Fleischer's renowned butcher training program, training a new generation of butchers and chefs that span the globe, focusing on sourcing, humane slaughter, and whole carcass utilization. He has lectured and conducted workshops and written for dozens of world-renowned organizations and publications. You can hear him on his radio show podcast, No Ounce Wasted, where he speaks with some of the world's most talented and passionate butchers, ranchers, chefs, and other meat industry professionals. He currently resides in the Hawaiian Islands and works for Maui Nui Venison, which I hope that we'll hear a little bit about. Bryan, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your busy day to come and listen to us.
Great. So you're a butcher. That's really cool that profession just still exists with all of these houses or machines that just kind of do a lot of the work. So how did you, that intro said a little bit, but how did you, like, on a personal level, get into this profession?
Completely randomly. I was in the music industry for a very long time. I was classically trained and worked in and around that industry in New York for many years, and it became quite difficult, and sort of saw the writing on the wall that maybe that wasn't my future, and kind of found myself in the culinary world through friends that had restaurants, and hopped on lines and things like that. And they were opening up a gourmet grocery in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I just popped in and asked if they needed some help. They said yes. And so I was behind the cheese counter and behind the fish counter. And one day the butcher didn't show up. And so the manager of the store asked a question, but it really wasn't a question, which was, so you've got this, yeah? And I said, sure. And that was it. I ran down into the walk-in. We were, it was mostly boxed meat, since, sort of this craft butchery movement really hadn't taken hold yet. And so I put Post-it notes all over the cuts of meat because I had no idea what they were. And I just started my quest to learn from there.
That's really interesting. So it was New York City.
Yeah, in Brooklyn. Yeah.
That's amazing. So you didn't like grow up on a farm and just learn it from
I did not. I found my way up there just through the desire and the quest to learn more. And it's how I met the Fleischer's folks, and how I started raising livestock and kind of becoming more and more involved in that part of the food system. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of livestock being raised in Brooklyn in those days.
That's great. So neither of you really grew up doing the stuff, or like that's really interesting. So when we as consumers are thinking about meat purchases in the store, or hunting for that matter, how do you think we should be viewing the meat that we take home, and how can we do our best to use all of the parts?
Well, I thought when I got into this industry, I didn't have a real, big understanding of what it meant to raise an animal and take it and to convert it into food. And so through the years of being in it, and my sort of opinions and things evolving, sort of started to look at it from an economics approach. We were starting to ask people to do something that they hadn't done in a long time, but also sort of bear the cost of this sort of new old way of doing things, right? Like, they see the money at the register chain's hands, right? It's not that they see this change of money through, the taxes that they pay, and all of those sorts of things. So how can we make it so the consumer has an easier time purchasing these things that are more expensive, at least at the point of sale? So looking at it from the economic standpoint, how can we really wring out every bit of value from this? So not just obviously consuming what you purchase and not throwing it away, but from the standpoint of, say, purchasing a whole chicken or purchasing a whole fish, not just looking at it from the standpoint of, oh, I just bought the breast, or I just bought this piece, but I have this whole thing. I'm going to feed my family with it. We might get 1, 2, maybe 3 meals out of it. I've got bones, so I've got bones for stock and broth, and all these sort of things that kind of add up and make the purchase of that just a bit more economical for the consumer. And then, as a parent, I look at it as a way to get my child involved, right? So we have this dinner or this meal, and then we have these leftovers. So how do I sort of create this environment where we're excited to to cook something different with whatever is left over. So, I think there's a lot of benefits from it. So the economics of it, the family time, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's super awesome. And so what's an example of a part of an animal that you think is really valuable culinarily, or whatever, that people might not know, and can you give it maybe a tip of how we could use that part?
Well, I think if you approach meat as a health food, which I think it is, and especially certain parts of meat, anything that has to do with the offal. So obviously things like liver and kidneys and hearts, all these things that are really nutrient dense. And I understand that there's a bit of an ick factor that's involved in these sorts of things. And so there's amazing ways to get those things into sort of a more digestible format. And ground is such a great way to do that. At a restaurant that I had, we had a burger that we called the El Corazon, right? And just, because you're always looking at ways to call things maybe that take people's mind away from what it is, the Europeans have such a great way to do that, so we call something head cheese, and, the French will call it fromage de tête, right? And you're like, oh, that sounds so lovely, right? So basically this burger was a ground beef burger, grass-fed and local from some farms not too far outside of Philly. And we just ground heart into it. And so just a really great way to get a bit more nutritional density into it. Also use what we bought, right? Because when we purchased animals, we get every bit that we can get back. So that's all the bone, all the viscera. If we can get the blood, we get the blood. And so just, sort of putting food into packages that are going to make it easier for the consumer to buy, right? Because we want to bring them along on this journey with us. We don't want to alienate them. And I think that's a thing that a lot of folks in the good food movements, certainly the good meat movement, we just expect them to show up and purchase the products, but we've got to help them, right? I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, cool. The awful. Is that how you say it? Really?
It's an awful. Yeah, it's a
awful.
there's the etymology of it is some people have some different sort of views on where it came from. I think the one that I think is the most realistic is that it's a play on all fall. As you eviscerate an animal, these things kind of fall out.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Sort of a play on that, I believe, but I could be wrong.
Cool. Well, I'd like to try that heart burger.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump back to Linda for a second. What about you, for as far as the vegetable world? And you're welcome to speak to the meat world as well, but if you want to highlight a recipe specifically from your book, or you did mention squash leaves, which I think is super interesting. I had never thought of eating those, but is there another vegetable that you enjoy growing, and culinarily it might not be one that, we think of buying when we go to the grocery store, but is actually really delicious and nutritious?
There's so many. I'm Vietnamese and Chinese. So I grew up in a household that fully utilized every part of the vegetable and every part of the meat. And it's really fun to hear Brian talk about his experiences, because when I was growing up, whole fish was very common, like bones and heads and cheeks and eyeballs and everything. I don't think I had a fish fillet until college. And hadn't really thought of fish being served in neat little portions like that. So this is what I grew up with, was always having the whole plant. And as a gardener, I see a lot more of these than most people do, because similar to meat, food tends to be very neatly packaged, even in the produce section. So one of my favorite parts of the vegetable is broccoli leaves, and you would never find that in the supermarket. And it would be very rare to find that in a farmer's market, because by the time it makes it through the supply chain, it would be pretty raggedy. But broccoli leaves have so much nutrition in them, because when you think about plants and the way they grow, the greens, because they're out there in the sun, we always talk about, when we think about healthy food, we talk about the antioxidants that come from their food, and antioxidants are actually a form of botanical sunscreen that the plants produce. And so when they're out in the sun, they produce antioxidants as a defense mechanism to protect themselves. And that's why lettuce leaves will turn purple or red. And it's sort of like a natural sunscreen that they give to themselves. So when you're picking any kind of root vegetable, you know, like carrots, turnips, radishes, or a broccoli plant where the head is already covered in leaves before it opens up, all of these parts that we normally don't do anything with actually have more nutrition than the parts that are underground or the parts that are covered. So that's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't think about. Like if you buy beets, you know, a lot of people don't think to use the beet greens or radishes. They don't think to put them in like a salad. And so all of these greens that come from root vegetables, especially, I like to find different ways to put them back together in my recipes, whether it's raw or whether it's cooked. I also like squash, melons, cucumbers, they're all part of the same family. So cucumber leaves are also very delicious. And with a lot of these vegetables, the different parts have a very similar taste. Maybe it's just like a little bit milder, or maybe it's a little bit more peppy. But, you know, like a lot of people who don't like radishes, spring radishes, and how spicy they are, they might be surprised to find that the leaves are actually a lot milder. Or like cucumber leaves, if you can pick a few of them from your plants, if you grow them at home, they have like this very refreshing cucumbery flavor that you otherwise wouldn't get from like lettuce or spinach. Same thing with pepper leaves, which is very common in Filipino cooking. People pick pepper leaves to use as like a seasoning for a soup that they make with chicken. So these are some of just like a few of the favorite ways that I use what I grow. But at farmers markets is where I usually find some of these more unusual parts. I love fava bean greens. I see those a lot of times. And then just trying to use up, like if you have a root vegetable where the greens are attached, I try to use up all of that as well. And leeks for some reason, like every recipe I find, they always tell you to discard the dark green ends and use only the white parts, but the dark green ends are just as delicious.
They are, it's so true. I don't know. They're really good for like an oniony stock broth if you want to use them for that.
Yeah, I mean, I just love them to use them in place of onions, and I don't know why more people don't use them or why they're always discarded, because I think the texture is just as great.
Yeah, the real old ones can get kind of tough, but if you slice them thin enough, it's totally fine. I've even just sprinkled some like a scallion, you know, on top of a salad or something like that. Yeah, that's super interesting about the pepper leaves. And actually that, I think there was a question in the chat, but also if you know, I know like some plants, obviously you can't eat all of the pieces. Like, I don't know, like potato leaves. I don't know if you can eat potato leaves, but are there any in particular that you can advise people to stay away from?
Yeah, there's actually not that much. The only two that I know of as far as what you would commonly grow in a home garden would be potato leaves and rhubarb leaves. So potato leaves contain solanine, which is a toxic chemical. So if you eat enough of it, it could cause adverse reactions. Same thing with rhubarb leaves. The interesting with rhubarb leaves is that it has oxalic acid, which gives it that tangy flavor that you get in the rhubarb stock as well. But there's a lot of other vegetables that contain oxalic acid. So spinach has it in a certain concentration. The problem is the rhubarb leaf is so massive that the general guideline of telling people not to eat a rhubarb leaf is because they're afraid people would cook the entire leaf. But when you think about it, it's attached to the stem that we eat. So if you have like a little bit of it, it's definitely not going to cause any harm, but generally it's advised to stay away from that. But everything else is fair game. So the most controversial part that I usually get pushback on are tomato leaves. People never find recipes for them, so they just automatically assume that tomato leaves are poisonous, but they are not.
Interesting, cool. So Brian, did you have something to add on that?
No, I'm learning just like everybody else. It's awesome.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so Linda, you're obviously a wealth of information about the vegetable and culinary uses of them. Is there other than buying this book that I highly recommend that you all do? What's a good way to learn about like how to grow these in my garden, or do you have any good resources about that?
Yes. So you can always go to my website, gardenbetty.com, and that's where I post all kinds of tutorials and recipes for the food that comes out of my garden, fruits, vegetables, and herbs. But I also have a free download for anyone who's at the presentation tonight. If you go to gardenbetty.com/edible, you can get a free cheat sheet that I've created. And it basically lists all of the most common vegetables that you can grow or buy in a grocery store. And I have all of the different parts that are edible from these plants, as well as preparation tips for the ones that are not as well known, and cooking tips too. So if you have a cucumber, for example, this cheat sheet, this guide will show you that you can eat the cucumber leaf, as well as the cucumber flower and the cucumber itself. But it also has a suggestion to let you know to try cooking or sauteing the cucumber, because it brings out a completely different texture. That is probably my favorite way to eat cucumber, instead of just throwing it raw into a salad. So you can get this guide at gardenbetty.com/edible, and then start experimenting in the kitchen with all of these different parts.
Cool. That's really great. I look forward to checking it out. And yeah, I like how much you're talking about I have a friend who thinks that cucumber is the strongest flavored vegetable that exists. It does. And I have another friend who refers, like, she won't even eat anything she doesn't like it. And she calls them flavor stains. She says the cucumber leaves flavor stains on everything. I love it.
And it's interesting because a lot of times, like, the skins can be bitter, and with food, bitterness usually equates to how much healthier they are for you, because it all comes down to those antioxidants again.
Awesome.
But if you saute the cucumber, it actually makes it sweeter. So.
Cool. I've never tried that. Awesome. Okay, Brian, I want us to go back to you for a moment. I know I mentioned earlier, and you did too, you work currently for a wild venison, a company that sells venison that is wild, and maybe you could do better at describing what it is than I am. But I wonder if you could talk about the sustainability of that practice.
Yeah, sure. So I moved to Hawaii about 3 years ago to work for a beef company. There are a lot of cattle in the state of Hawaii. Parker Ranch, which is on Hawaii Island or Big Island, is one of the largest cow-calf operations in the country. So Hawaii obviously has really fertile soil, a growing season that can pretty much last all year, depending on what you're growing, but not a lot of infrastructure. The transition out of working for the cattle company, as I sort of became familiar with these folks working with venison, about 180 years ago, somebody brought over some deer to the islands as their own personal stock, and they got out because nature always finds a way. These deer were brought over from India. And they're known as access deer, and they have some very interesting traits that make them really good at what they do, which is eating tons of forage and breeding prolifically. The other thing is that there are no predators on the island whatsoever. So these deer are from India. They've existed and developed to evade tigers and large apex predators. That doesn't exist here. So we've got an environmental issue with an invasive species that pretty much eats everything and anything that comes in their way. So disrupting forage for cattle farmers, obviously eroding soil, and that soil finding its way into oceans, and so a whole host of environmental impacts. A lot of states have these problems with invasive species, and they employ eradication programs, which just basically means they try to hunt these things into extinction, without really thinking about food insecurity and the fact that here is this protein that's readily available for people. So some really intelligent folks that I happen to work for came up with a program, petitioned the USDA to allow a wild harvest of an animal, which doesn't exist anywhere in this country at all. It's the first of its kind. And there's some reasons why that's allowed here. A lot of it has to do with some issues that I think we're all aware of in terms of native lands and who owns those native lands, and they're private lands now, so to speak. And so that's a whole other issue that I won't go into now. So we hunt these animals. We hunt them at night to sort of mimic how they would normally graze and browse. It's all done under the supervision of the USDA. And then we harvest and make available here on the island and also back on the continent a wild harvested venison. Yeah.
Super interesting. Yeah, no predators on the islands. It's
none. Mongoose, that's it. Yeah.
And the mongoose, yeah, you can see them. They don't have any predators though. I'm sitting like, just like laying on the rocks, like rock. Yeah. Cool. Super interesting.
And I would add what the other thing so along with offering this really nutrient dense meat and all the parts that come with it, we've got a bone broth and a stock program. We do an offal blend as well. Is that it looks at and brings to the forefront the idea of managing animals and managing our wild animal population here in sort of a confined area, but also brings attention to hunting, whether you're doing it for sustenance or what. But this idea that can be a part of our food system as well, and that it is very obviously a part of very many people's food system. So
yeah, awesome, cool. Well. And what's the website where people can learn more about that venison?
Sure. Company? It is Maui Nui Venison.com.
Awesome. And I'll put that in the resource list as well, along with everything else.
Yep.
Okay, so someone had a question about how much of the giblets could you get away with adding to ground meat and not have your 18-year-old notice?
Don't tell them at all. That's the main thing, right? You just don't tell them it's in there. You just let them figure it out a few years later, and then therapy and all that sort of thing. It's a really difficult thing to say. Some folks use a percentage. Some say 5%. Some say 10%. Those things are really hard. I never talk about taste, right? Because it's such a subjective thing. So, get as much in as you can until one night or afternoon somebody goes, this tastes a little different, and then just feign ignorance and roll it back the next time.
Okay,
that's what I do.
I love it. I used to work on a boat, and the captain was just, I am not a vegetarian. I will never be. I'm never eating any meal without meat. And I'm like, oh, okay, Alan. And so I cooked him up some soy chorizo tacos, and he had no idea what he was eating. He's like, these are the best tacos I've ever eaten. I'm like, yeah, that's right.
When I first started, I would make sausage, and you'd buy a whole pig and you'd get a lot of the parts, and pork kidneys are a really hard thing to get people to buy on their own. So I would just put them in the sausages, right? And so sausage is such a heavily spiced thing anyway that you just never know. And it eased my conscience because I knew I was using the parts. So.
Yeah, not wasting. I love it. It's really great.
And now I'm going to get some emails.
That's okay. I'm sure most of the people on this call are Central Oregonians who may not have bought your sausage before. So maybe not. So if anyone has any other questions, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or you're welcome to put it in the chat box. That's great as well. I had one question about plastic packaging that I think either of you is welcome to. I can also tackle this one. What can we do about the plastic packaging on veggies and fruits? And I have two answers for you. Vote with your dollar. Don't don't buy those hothouse cucumbers that are wrapped in plastic. Just don't buy them. And bring your own produce bags to prevent that. I also encourage you to try not to buy your produce that come in the plastic clamshells that are not recyclable. And instead, maybe you can go to the gardenbetty.com website and learn how to grow some of your own, and then have a garden full of non-plasticized, very local produce. Was that too snarky? I don't know.
No, actually,
Don't buy it.
like, I mean, there is a grocery store, and I won't name it, but we probably all know, what it is. But I make it a point not to buy produce from that store because everything is encased in plastic.
Rhymes with Frater Rose.
Yeah, something like that. So, I'm always 50-50 on the plastic bag, not the plastic shopping bag, but the plastic produce bag debate, because even though we do use too many of them, but I find that a big part of food waste is improper storage. So people buying all of this food and not able to make that last the week. So these plastic produce bags that we use from the grocery stores are actually excellent for storing all of our produce in, because the main thing that you always want to do when you bring home fresh vegetables is hold in moisture. Our refrigerators, even the modern ones these days, are actually very dry. So by storing all of your vegetables in plastic produce bags and loosely sealing them, you will actually prolong the life of all of your food.
That's a very good point, and thank you for bringing that up. I like it. And it's hard. It is hard to avoid. Plastic is also something that you can reuse in your kitchen. Those are some options, and there are some, plastic alternatives, but wasting food is worse than using a little extra plastic. Okay, here's one for Brian. I hear deer hooves are good for bone broth. Can you describe in gory detail, or maybe not so gory detail, how the hooves from the animal get into the pot?
So we call them trotters, just like you would off of a hog. And it's just it's a very simple process. I mean, it is literally removing them at the joint and cooking them down. Was that the question? Like how they wind up in the pot?
I'm not sure if whoever asked that wants to clarify.
I had that question. I was just wondering about the butchering process itself, how to physically get it. It's on the bone right there, and the hooves itself are hard to get off. So I don't know if you just kind of put that whole lower joint with the hooves, everything in the pot, or what?
Yeah, so there's a removal, right? Because there's a toenail, if you will. And so if you're harvesting it, if you're hunting it yourself, you'd probably want to remove that. And you can simply do that by sort of bringing it up to a boil, usually about 140, 150 degrees, and it'll kind of pull or slide right off. Obviously discard that water. You don't get that if you're hunting, you obviously don't have the same issues you would have necessarily from domesticated livestock in terms of like fecal matter and things like that on hooves, because they're kind of not standing around in it all day. But yeah, you'd want to remove that, discard that water, and then add it back into your stock or whatever you're going to cook it down with.
Awesome, cool. And another question for Brian, and maybe for Linda too. Do you have any favorite cookbooks for preparing meat parts that may not have that people may not have prepared before?
Hearts or parts? Just
parts. Whatever part that might describe like how in detail how you might.
Oh yeah, there's a wonderful cookbook that just happens to be on the floor here. My partner is working on a cookbook with some colleagues of mine, so that's all the artwork. I'll probably get in trouble for pointing that out there. But there's a beautiful book called Pork and Sons that is just lovely. It's beautiful. It's written by a Frenchman, Stéphane Renaud, and it talks about just family and cooking and sharing meals together, and it's a really great cookbook that really goes into cooking every bit of the animal. And then all the Hugh Fernley Whittingstall, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, all his books on cooking meat, baking bread, and cooking with vegetables. I think they're awesome. I'm sure you've got tons more than I do in terms of resources on vegetable cooking and stuff.
Brian, would you mind typing into the chat the name of that cookbook you just noted, and also the author that you mentioned? And Linda,
sure.
do you have any other cookbooks specific to meat parts that you wanted to recommend?
Yeah, actually, I have referenced Hank Shaw's books quite a bit, and he has a few of them, and they usually focus on different sets of animals. I believe that it's focused on hunting and then how to use all of the different parts of the animal that you hunt. So he's got books on like pheasants and duck and deer and elk. I mean, there's like every wild animal that you would hunt. He has recipes for it, both in his books and on his website. So he's always been my go-to.
Awesome. Yeah. Buck, moose, and duck, goose.
Yeah.
So good.
I'll add to that too. You know, for those of you that are interested in the hunting aspect of things, there's so much out there now. So like we just talked about Hank Shaw, Steve Ranella, there's an Instagram page and a company called Modern Huntsman, which is really great because they look to make the hunting community a much more inviting community. You know, I don't think it's much of a secret that community has been a little, you know, chest thumping and a little, you know, aggro-y, probably, yeah, which isn't the most inviting or welcoming thing in the world. And so their mission is to sort of open that world up and really let people see the importance of hunting in terms of population control and sustenance and all of that. And so they've got a lot of really cool resources, and they do a lot of partnerships with you know, folks like Traeger and all these other kind of folks to get you excited about cooking.
Awesome. What was that blog again?
Modern Huntsman.
Okay, great. Okay, is there any questions that I am missing? Or does anyone have any burning questions that they wanted to ask? We're start getting toward the end here.
I see one in the chat box from Denise, where she says, which vegetable part gave me the biggest aha moment when I first cooked with it? So it would probably be the squash leaves, because that's one of the parts that you can pull from your garden where you're not going to stunt or affect the growth of the plant, because there's gazillions of squash leaves that come from the plant before the fruits or the flowers ever come. So learning how to use the shoots, which are the tender young growth coming from that plant, was probably the first moment where I thought, oh, like this can actually work, you know, like I can harvest from this plant much sooner than the 60 to 80 days it takes to harvest zucchini or any kind of squash. So I would say that was the first one. And then the first time that I cooked with sweet potato vines, which are not to be confused with potato vines, right? Sweet potatoes and potatoes are from completely different families, but you can eat sweet potato vines and the leaves. And they're very mild, kind of like spinach. They're very tender, great for like stir fries and sauteing and throwing into soups. And I always remembered my parents cooking with that when I was younger, but it always came in a bag that they got from the Asian market. So it wasn't until I grew some at home and saw the vines where I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been eating, you know, the whole time when I was a child. And now like, I get it. There's a lot of vines that come from that one plant. And with that, it's great because you can just harvest as much as you need to before you dig up the tubers.
Cool, super cool. Okay, well, I think we're at about time here. So I'm gonna go ahead and conclude. Just a reminder to everyone that if you're interested in entering the drawing, please enter your name into the Google form. And if Lindsay, you could put that in the chat, thank you. And we'll do a random drawing and contact the winners. Again, we have 7 copies of Linda's book and a $50 gift card to Central Oregon Locavore that we would love to give away. Additionally, we wanted to let you know that the Environmental Center is hiring for the position of Rethink Waste Program Manager. And you'll see the link to that job announcement in the chat box. Should you be interested in applying, or if you know someone else who might be, feel free to share it. We hope you enjoyed this evening's panel and are coming away with some new insights. And as mentioned, look out for that email from me with all the resources mentioned for us at the Environmental Center, as well as from all of the panelists. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me. Aloha, everybody.
Bye, everyone.